On linguistic aspects of translation. According to Bertrand Russell, no one can understand the word cheese unless he has a non-linguistic acquaintance with cheese. If, however, we follow Russell's fundamental precept and place our emphasis upon the linguistic aspects of traditional philosophical problems, then we are obliged to state that no one can understand the word cheese unless he has an acquaintance with the meaning assigned to this word in the lexical code of English. Any representative of a cheeseless culinary culture will understand the English word cheese if he is aware that in this language it means food made of pressed curds, and if he has at least a linguistic acquaintance with curds. We never consumed ambrosia or nectar, and have only a linguistic acquaintance with the words ambrosia, nectar, and gods, the name of their mythical users. Nonetheless, we understand these words and know in what contexts each of them may be used. The meaning of the words cheese, apple, nectar, acquaintance, but, mere, and of any word or phrase whatsoever, is definitely a linguistic, or to be more precise and less narrow, a semiotic fact. Against those who assign meaning, signatum, not to the sign, but to the thing itself, the simplest and truest argument would be that nobody has ever smelled or tasted the meaning of cheese or of apple. There is no signatum without signum. The meaning of the word cheese cannot be inferred from a non-linguistic acquaintance with cheddar or with camembert without the assistance of the verbal code. An array of linguistic signs is needed to introduce an unfamiliar word. Mere pointing will not teach us whether cheese is the name of the given specimen, or of any box of camembert, or of camembert in general, or of any cheese, any milk product, any food, any refreshment, or perhaps any box, irrespective of contents. Finally, does a word simply name the thing in question, or does it imply a meaning, such as offering, sale, prohibition, or malediction? Pointing actually may mean malediction. In some cultures, particularly in Africa, it is an ominous gesture. For us, both as linguists and as ordinary word users, the meaning of any linguistic sign is its translation into some further alternative sign, especially a sign in which it is more fully developed, as Peirce, the deepest inquirer into the essence of signs, insistently stated. The term bachelor may be converted into a more explicit designation, unmarried man, whenever higher explicitness is required. We distinguish three ways of interpreting a verbal sign. It may be translated into other signs of the same language, into another language, or into another non-verbal system of symbols. These three kinds of translation are to be differently labeled. 1. Intralingual translation or rewording is an interpretation of verbal signs by means of other signs of the same language. 2. Intralingual translation, or translation proper, is an interpretation of verbal signs by means of some other language. 3. Intersemiotic translation, or transmutation, is an interpretation of verbal signs by means of signs of non-verbal sign systems. The intralingual translation of a word uses either another, more or less synonymous word, or resorts to a circumlocution. Yet synonymy, as a rule, is not complete equivalence. For example, every celibate is a bachelor, but not every bachelor is a celibate. A word, or an idiomatic phrase word, briefly a code unit of the highest level, may be fully interpreted only by means of an equivalent combination of code units, i.e., a message referring to this code unit. Every bachelor is an unmarried man, and every unmarried man is a bachelor. Or every celibate is bound not to marry, and everyone who is bound not to marry is a celibate. Likewise, on the level of interlingual translation, there is ordinarily no full equivalence between code units, while messages may serve as adequate interpretations of alien code units or messages. The English word cheese cannot be completely identified with its standard Russian heteronym, sir, because cottage cheese is a cheese, but not a sir. Russians say, "Prinesite sir I tvorog," bring cheese and, seek, cottage cheese. In Standard Russian, the food made of pressed curds is called syr only if ferment is used. Most frequently, however, translation from one language into another substitutes messages in one language not for separate code units, but for entire messages in some other language. Such a translation is a reported speech. The translator recodes and transmits a message received from another source. Thus, translation involves two equivalent messages in two different codes. Equivalence in difference is the cardinal problem of language and the pivotal concern of linguistics. Like any receiver of verbal messages, the linguist acts as their interpreter. No linguistic specimen may be interpreted by the science of language without a translation of its signs into other signs of the same system or into signs of another system. Any comparison of two languages implies an examination of their mutual translatability. Widespread practice of interlingual communication, particularly translating activities, must be kept under constant scrutiny by linguistic science. It is difficult to overestimate the urgent need for, and the theoretical and practical significance of, differential bilingual dictionaries with careful comparative definition of all the corresponding units in their intension and extension. Likewise, differential bilingual grammars should define what unifies and what differentiates the two languages in their selection and delimitation of grammatical concepts. Both the practice and the theory of translation abound with intricacies, and from time to time attempts are made to sever the Gordian knot by proclaiming the dogma of untranslatability. Mr. Everyman, the natural logician, vividly imagined by Lee Whorf, is supposed to have arrived at the following bit of reasoning. Facts are unlike to speakers whose language background provides for unlike formulation of them. In the first years of the Russian Revolution, there were fanatic visionaries who argued, in Soviet periodicals, for a radical revision of traditional language, and particularly for the weeding out of such misleading expressions as sunrise or sunset. Yet we still use this Ptolemaic imagery without implying a rejection of a Copernican doctrine, and we can easily transform our customary talk about the rising and setting sun into a picture of the Earth's rotation, simply because any sign is translatable into a sign in which it appears to us more fully developed and precise. A faculty of speaking a given language implies a faculty of talking about this language. Such a metalinguistic operation permits revision and redefinition of the vocabulary used. The complementarity of both levels, object language and metalanguage, was brought out by Niels Bohr. All well-defined experimental evidence must be expressed in ordinary language, in which the practical use of every word stands in complementary relation to attempts of its strict definition. All cognitive experience and its classification is conveyable in any existing language. Whenever there is deficiency, terminology may be qualified and amplified by loanwords or loan translations, neologisms or semantic shifts, and finally by circumlocutions. Thus, in the newborn literary language of the Northeast Siberian Chuckese, screw is rendered as rotating nail, steel as hard iron, tin as thin iron, chalk as writing soap, watch as hammering heart. Even seemingly contradictory circumlocutions like electrical horse car, the first Russian name of the horseless streetcar, or flying steamship, Yana Paragot, the Koryak term for the airplane, simply designate the electrical analog of the horse car and the flying analog of the steamer and do not impede communication, just as there is no semantic noise and disturbance in the double oxymoron, cold beef and pork hot dog. No lack of grammatical device in the language translated into makes impossible a literal translation of the entire conceptual information contained in the original. The traditional conjunctions and, or, are now supplemented by a new connective, and or, which was discussed a few years ago in the witty book Federal Prose, How to Write in and or for Washington. Of these three conjunctions, only the latter occurs in one of the Samoyed languages. Despite these differences in the inventory of conjunctions, all three varieties of messages observed in Federal Prose may be distinctly translated both into traditional English and into this Samoyed language. Federal Prose. 1. John and Peter. 2. John or Peter. 3. John and or Peter will come. Traditional English. 3. John and Peter, or one of them, will come. Samoyed, John and or Peter both will come. 2. John and or Peter, one of them, will come. If some grammatical category is absent in a given language, its meaning may be translated into this language by lexical means. Dual forms, like Old Russian brata, are translated with the help of the numeral, 2 brothers. It is more difficult to remain faithful to the original when we translate into a language provided with a certain grammatical category from a language devoid of such a category. When translating the English sentence, she has brothers, into a language which discriminates dual and plural, we are compelled either to make our own choice between two statements, she has 2 brothers, she has more than 2, or to leave the decision to the listener and say, she has either 2 or more than 2 brothers. Again, in translating from a language without grammatical number into English, one is obliged to select one of the 2 possibilities, brother or brothers, or to confront the receiver of this message with a 2-choice situation. She has either 1 or more than 1 brother. As Boas neatly observed, the grammatical pattern of a language, as opposed to its lexical stock, determines those aspects of each experience that must be expressed in the given language. We have to choose between these aspects, and one or the other must be chosen. In order to translate accurately the English sentence, I hired a worker, a Russian needs supplementary information, whether this action was completed or not, and whether the worker was a man or a woman, because he must make his choice between a verb of completive or non-completive aspect, and between a masculine and feminine noun. If I ask the utterer of the English sentence whether the worker was male or female, my question may be judged irrelevant or indiscreet, whereas in the Russian version of this sentence, an answer to this question is obligatory. On the other hand, whatever the choice of Russian grammatical forms to translate the quoted English message, the translation will give no answer to the question of whether I hired or have hired the worker, or whether he, she, was an indefinite or definite worker, a or the. Because the information required by the English and Russian grammatical pattern is unlike, we face quite different sets of 2-choice situations. Therefore, a chain of translations of one and the same isolated sentence from English into Russian and vice versa could entirely deprive such a message of its initial content. The Geneva linguist S. Karasevsky used to compare such a gradual loss with a circular series of unfavorable currency transactions. But evidently, the richer the context of a message, the smaller the loss of information. Languages differ essentially in what they must convey, and not in what they may convey. Each verb of a given language imperatively raises a set of specific yes or no questions, as for instance, is the narrated event conceived with or without reference to its completion? Is the narrated event presented as prior to the speech event or not? Naturally, the attention of native speakers and listeners will be constantly focused on such items as are compulsory in their verbal code. In its cognitive function, language is minimally dependent on the grammatical pattern because the definition of our experience stands in complementary relation to metalinguistic operations. The cognitive level of language not only admits, but directly requires recoding interpretation, i.e., translation. Any assumption of ineffable or untranslatable cognitive data would be a contradiction in terms. But in jest, in dreams, in magic, briefly, in what one would call everyday verbal mythology, and in poetry above all, the grammatical categories carry a high semantic import. In these conditions, the question of translation becomes much more entangled and controversial. Even such a category as grammatical gender, often cited as merely formal, plays a great role in the mythological attitudes of a speech community. In Russian, the feminine cannot designate a male person, nor the masculine specify a female. Ways of personifying or metaphorically interpreting inanimate nouns are prompted by their gender. A test in the Moscow Psychological Institute, 1915, showed that Russians, prone to personify the weekdays, consistently represented Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday as males, and Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday as females, without realizing that this distribution was due to the masculine gender of the first 3 names, as against the feminine gender of the others. The fact that the word for Friday is masculine in some Slavic languages and feminine in others is reflected in the folk traditions of the corresponding peoples, which differ in their Friday ritual. The widespread Russian superstition that a fallen knife presages a male guest and a fallen fork a female one is determined by the masculine gender of knife and the feminine of fork in Russian. In Slavic and other languages, where day is masculine and night feminine, day is represented by poets as the lover of night. The Russian painter Repin was baffled as to why sin had been depicted as a woman by German artists. He did not realize that sin is feminine in German, die Sünde, but masculine in Russian. Likewise, a Russian child, while reading a translation of German tales, was astounded to find that death, obviously a woman, was pictured as an old man, German der Tod, masculine. My Sister Life, the title of a book of poems by Boris Pasternak, is quite natural in Russian, where life is feminine, but was enough to reduce to despair the Czech poet Josef Hora in his attempt to translate these poems, since in Czech this noun is masculine. What was the initial question which arose in Slavic literature at its very beginning? Curiously enough, the translator's difficulty in preserving the symbolism of genders and the cognitive irrelevance of this difficulty appears to be the main topic of the earliest Slavic original work. The preface to the first translation of the Evangeliarium, made in the early 860s by the founder of Slavic letters and liturgy, Constantine the philosopher, and recently restored and interpreted by André Vaillant. Greek, when translated into another language, cannot always be reproduced identically, and that happens to each language being translated, the Slavic apostle states. Masculine nouns, as river and star in Greek, are feminine in another language. According to Vaillant's commentary, this divergence effaces the symbolic identification of the rivers with demons and of the stars with angels in the Slavic translation of two of Matthew's verses, 7:25 and 2:9. But to this poetic obstacle, St. Constantine resolutely opposes the precept of Dionysius the Areopagite, who called for chief attention to the cognitive values and not to the words themselves. In poetry, verbal equations become a constructive principle of the text. Syntactic and morphological categories, roots and affixes, phonemes and their components, distinctive features, in short, any constituents of the verbal code, are confronted, juxtaposed, brought into contiguous relation according to the principle of similarity and contrast, and carry their own autonomous signification. Phonemic similarity is sensed as semantic relationship. The pun, or to use a more erudite and perhaps more precise term, paronomasia, reigns over poetic art, and whether its rule is absolute or limited, poetry, by definition, is untranslatable. Only creative transposition is possible, either intralingual transposition from one poetic shape into another, or interlingual transposition from one language into another, or finally, into semiotic transposition from one system of signs into another, e.g., from verbal art into music, dance, cinema, or painting. If we were to translate into English the traditional formula traduttore, traditore, as the translator is a betrayer, we would deprive the Italian rhyming epigram of all its paronomastic value. Hence, a cognitive attitude would compel us to change this aphorism into a more explicit statement, and to answer the questions: translator of what messages? Betrayer of what values?